Welcome to AI and Multilateralism, a playlist of conversations here at the Commons, our space at the UN Library and Archives Geneva for sharing knowledge on multilateralism. In this series, we're joined by experts who help us unpack the many ideas and issues at the nexus of AI and international cooperation. Today, we're asking the question, is it ethical to use AI in multilateral deliberations? We're joined by Eleonore Fournier-Tombs, Head of Anticipatory Action and Innovation at the UNU-CPR, the United Nations University Center for Policy Research. There, she leads a team providing strategic advice on AI risk, policy, and technology strategy to international agencies, regulators, and executives. As a data scientist, she's worked in the private sector and across the UN system. And we're diving into her research on the ethics of using AI in multilateral fora. Eleonore, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much.
We're recording this during the 80th session of the General Assembly. It's a busy week there in New York, and a lot of issues are being deliberated. One, of course, being about AI and how it can be governed collectively. Later today is going to be the launch of the Global Dialogue on AI Governance at the UN, which is one of the two major mechanisms recently established by the UN to promote international cooperation on AI governance. I'm sure you're very interested to see what happens at the launch today, but is there anything else you'd like to share about what's been happening this week in discussions on AI?
Yes, of course. And it is a very exciting time for global AI governance. Really, the UN started severely leaning into global AI governance in 2023. Before that, we had UNESCO that kind of led with the recommendation on the ethics of AI. And then it became much more mainstream in terms of the Secretariat's leadership and the Tech Envoy's leadership around the summer of 2023. And that's when they established the high-level advisory body on AI, which our team provided a lot of research support for. And the advisory body came together, there was 38 members, and they came together for 1 year, where they developed recommendations on how the UN could take a leadership role in the risks and opportunities of AI. And they came up with 7 recommendations, a few of which were adopted in the Global Digital Compact last year. And now finally, we're at the implementation of these recommendations. And those are the global dialogues and the International Scientific Panel on AI. So very briefly, the International Scientific Panel on AI, which has also been announced and adopted, and now we need to select the 40 members of this panel. Its aim is to provide global technical consensus on the risks and opportunities of AI. And that's actually quite important because it provides a foundation for all of the other policy work that's done by member states. We do a lot of this kind of scientific consensus, technical consensus at the UN. And although there's no kind of strict policy recommendations that come out of it, it's not a convention from part of the human rights framework, for example, it's still really important work so that we all kind of agree globally on where this technology is going and what we want to do about it. And then, as you mentioned, today they're going to launch the Global Dialogues on AI, which will be a forum for discussion and deliberation every year and on a regular basis to talk about all the different issues around AI. So for me, this week, I've spoken a lot about AI and the environment. I think this is a kind of upcoming issue that we're starting to look at very seriously, especially with generative AI tool that consumes so much more energy than other kinds of AI. We've also talked a lot about international standards. So to me, international standards in AI are a source of a lot of hope for multilateralism because although we tend to see a convergence on the risks and opportunities of AI more broadly, there's not a lot of argument when we say, there are potential biases in AI or there's privacy considerations in AI. And we also say when we want to use AI for the public good and to improve people's lives, we're not arguing immensely, but I do feel that there's so much fragmentation when it comes to the solutions to that. And international standards are a way forward where a lot of parties, whether it's governments, private sector, civil society, different member states with completely different legal philosophy and kind of historical approach to technology, they're all kind of coming on board and agreeing to put out these standards. And so I find that this is a time of a lot of hope for AI governance. I think it's bringing a lot of countries together, and I really hope that we can continue, making big strides in international cooperation on these topics.
It must be interesting for you to see how, based out of the AI advisory body, these key recommendations for a scientific panel, a global dialogue, this has been adopted by the UN and is being really launched and discussed. We're going to be talking a lot in this series about this element of the global governance of AI and what that means for multilateralism. But a lot of your work and your research is actually looking also at how AI is changing the practice of diplomacy, the practice of multilateral deliberation. And so I wanted to really touch on that today, the use of AI in multilateral deliberations. Can we firstly define deliberation? What does this mean? And why is this important to multilateralism?
Great question. And I've been working on the topic of deliberation for a really long time. And what we're discussing today, the use of AI in global deliberations, is part of work that is going to be published in Ethics and International Affairs in a few months, which was developed with the help of my deliberation co-author, Michael McKenzie, who teaches at Vancouver Island University. And I'm mentioning him because we've done a lot of publications and projects together on deliberation. Deliberation is almost everything that really takes place at the UN Secretariat. It's a really core function of setting global goals and objectives and norms. And it's a process that member states go to exchange ideas and perspectives so that they can come together in a type of convergence or a decision. And so we have deliberation in a lot of political processes. When you look at national level government, parliaments, that's all deliberation. We start to see also deliberative processes in a kind of different way taking place online. So a lot of people study the way in which we participate and exchange ideas on social media and grow our political opinions. And so technology has really been closely intertwined with deliberation for about 20 years now, because we've been using so many technological platforms for this shaping of ideas. And so with AI, it's really a fascinating topic because AI also generates new ideas and content. And I've been very interested in figuring out how that impacts the global deliberations, because it seemed to me that we might be losing a little bit of our autonomy and our agency by inserting AI into deliberative processes. That's kind of where this article is going and this research is going.
You mentioned that technology has been intertwined and used in global deliberation for already about 20 years. What is the state of play now? How is AI being used in global deliberations?
So now we're about 2 years in for generative AI. I would say that before then, the only way that we would really inject AI in global deliberations is through the use of predictive analytics, where we could have data and bring data to the table. So it's very, very different and not really a source of immense concern. I think for generative AI, it's a little bit different because we have what I've kind of categorized as these formal uses and informal uses. And for formal uses, I mean uses of AI that are explicit, that are intentional, and that are kind of bounded. So that could be, for example, the use of an AI tool as a moderator. So we've all seen in Zoom calls and in Teams calls that AI agents can attend and take a summary of the meeting. There's also been some experiments which have been very fascinating on using AI in a more separate platform from our regular tools and having the AI tool not only summarize, but point out areas of convergence and divergence so that the participants would be able to go deeper into these topics and understand where is the position of different players. We're very big on inclusion here at the UN, and it is difficult for people to come to deliberative forums in person. And it's also challenging to participate everybody at the same time when there's hundreds of people waiting for their turn to speak. And are people really discussing amongst themselves, or are they doing kind of what we call in deliberation positional politics. So we see a lot of that at the UN this week, is that every party is coming in with their written script and they're just speaking, and then the next person speaks and they're not referring to each other's content. And that's not good deliberation. That's just kind of positional. And so formal uses of AI have a potential to support some of these and just improve the quality of deliberation and improve participation and inclusion and diversity of perspectives. So in that way, I am optimistic. Where I wanted to raise the alarm a little bit and just bring diplomats and other policymakers on the global stage into this conversation is the informal uses of AI. And where I think it's very critical to reflect is where AI tools are writing people's speeches and interpreting the speeches and the contributions of others without any filters. And we started to see this a couple of years ago. And the way in which I started to observe this is in duplication. So you would see a senior policymaker who maybe had not had time to write speaking points. You would hear them speak, and then you would hear the next person say the same sentences. And the reason why this happened is because, AI tools, generative AI tools, actually only have a very limited creativity, and they can't replace what is happening inside your brain. And so it would kind of regenerate the same talking points over and over again. And so people were repeating themselves. That's the only way that you would really know that this is happening. So for me, it actually brought up a whole bunch of different issues that are a little bit beyond what we speak about with regular AI risk conversations. So with regular AI risk, we're talking about things like bias, exclusion, we're talking about hallucinations. And I think these are all continue to be challenges that we face in AI, but there's something around AI in global deliberations that's very unique.
You mentioned that a lot of discussion today is on the technical risks of AI, like bias, exclusion, a lack of languages, hallucinations, environmental issues. But you also, in your research, look much deeper at the ethical issues. And some that you refer to in your work are ideas like technological determinism, sovereignty and self-determination, the actual legitimacy of global deliberations themselves, if we continue down this way of mostly informal use of AI and AI agents. Could we explore that a little bit further? What do we mean by technological determinism?
In this work, we've identified 3 different areas of concern. And as you mentioned, there's determinism. We also have this idea of state sovereignty and self-determination, which I think is a little bit compromised with AI, and authenticity. So for technological determinism, that's the idea that all events, including human actions and thoughts, are caused by forces external to free will. So it's a kind of a philosophical idea, and particularly are caused by technology that we're using. And so the idea is that the medium itself and the technological tool that is being used is shaping people's ideas and people's free will. So to me, this is extremely relevant today because we're having our ideas shaped actively by AI tools. And my concern is that because the UN is focused on developing global norms and objectives and decisions that are going to shape the future of humanity and of the earth, to what extent are these ideas shaped by the technology that we're using itself? And I think it's really important to take a step back and say every single action where we just put in a prompt and say, write my whole speaking points and don't check and don't apply a critical perspective, you're not the one who is contributing those ideas into the deliberation. An AI tool is contributing those ideas based on training data and random things on the internet and whatever guardrails are in place by the generative AI tool. And in a deliberation, the convergence and the consensus is based on all of the individual inputs, and then the way in which they kind of mesh together and that people discuss and come up with new ideas. And so if each of the individual inputs start becoming compromised in this way, I think it's really a source of concern and something that we should take a step back and really think about the impact that might have.
So if we're all using AI in writing speeches, in how we deliberate in multilateral settings, the technology itself is thinking for us.
So that's my concern. We certainly do not have to use AI that way. There's generative AI tools have a lot of power and can do a lot of different things. And so I'm a data scientist. I'm not against technology in any way, but I don't think that we should allow generative AI tools to do our thinking for us, especially when we're active participants in global deliberations. So a generative AI tool can help in a lot of different ways. It can help with a little bit of research. It can help to structure ideas. It can help to summarize what you wanted to say, maybe to some speaking points. But every time that people are entering a deliberation unprepared and have not really thought what they wanted to say, and they're just putting a prompt or putting a speech by another member state into AI and getting a response, that's where you're losing your own participation. And I think that then goes to another level, because the UN is also a forum for deliberation for member states. And so each state, each country that is part of the UN is responsible for their own country and for the decisions that they're going to be participating in. So the UN is not a global government that has authority over its member states. The member states ultimately have their own freedom and self-determination. And so they willingly participate in negotiations. They willingly participate in conventions and agreements and in shaping ideas at the UN. And so if the positions of member states are drafted by AI agents rather than by a diplomatic representative of the citizens of that state, the states themselves are not being authentically represented. And again, what we would see if we took this exercise to the fullest, we would see that each state is actually representing the same kind of ideas mashed up from the internet. And we can also add that there is certainly only a few states that provide the generative AI tools, and only a few states that are overrepresented in the training data. So that would mean that you would have an overrepresentation of the ideas coming from these states, these kind of AI powers, and an underrepresentation of ideas coming authentically from the other member states. And so you would have a very, very strange situation from my perspective, where the real needs and perspectives of the citizens and residents of UN member states would no longer be very clearly articulated and represented on a global stage.
So on that note of self-determination and looking at how global deliberations are a space for all countries, all member states to bring forth their ideas, their values, their priorities for global development, what would you say is the biggest risk in terms of self-determination if we continue to use AI in these ways?
I think there's two things. One of them is that we're going to run out of good ideas. I think the only way that we can have really good and long-lasting solutions at the UN is if we have real diversity of perspective and creativity. And I just don't see that with a generative AI tool at scale. I think we have to represent ourselves. And the other thing is loss of legitimacy. So if we see that member states are not really representing their citizens, the citizens are going to lose faith in the organization. And that's something we sometimes forget at the UN, is that this is member state contributions that's running the UN, and that comes from income tax and from other kinds of taxes. And so if people feel that they're no longer being authentically represented, they're going to lose faith in the UN system. And so we're threatening the multilateral system at large.
You mentioned authenticity. Could we explore a bit more what this means in terms of our agency? Because you also look at something called epistemic agency and genuine agency. Can you break that down for us in terms of what it means for multilateralism?
Yes. So authenticity is, again, one of these kind of political theory terms, which means the degree to which a political representative is considered to be genuine and true and aligned with what they say that they're going to be done. So it's very important when in democracies we elect political representatives that they're believable and we can consider them authentic to the ideas that they're representing. So either they're not necessarily part of a community, but they understand the community and are going to really represent their perspectives, or often we like electing people that are a member of a certain community, that we feel they have lived experience. And so that's where authenticity is really critical. And this idea of agency is very connected to this. Agency is the idea that we have an impact on the political decisions that are being made. We can choose. We have choice. And if political decisions are made by non-human forces, we lose agency in terms of where we're going to go as a world. And I think that's really important because we shouldn't feel that we're kind of passively watching the global and geopolitical events. And I think a lot of the times these days, there's just been a lot of change and a lot of movement and a lot of concerning events on the geopolitical stage. And many people have felt a loss of agency, both from a political perspective and from a technological perspective. So many conversations that I've had have been around this idea of AI is coming and there's nothing I can do about it. I'm kind of losing my sense of being able to shape the life that I have. And so it goes down not only to at the global level, but also at the very individual level, where people are saying, I don't know the kind of world that my children are going to grow up in. I don't know if I can really guarantee that I'm going to be able to pay for my rent and have meaningful work, because I feel that I'm losing my sense of self and agency to these AI tools. And so this issue that we're seeing at the multilateral level, it really drills down also to the individual level. And that's why we need to understand our approach to these tools and really change our mindset when it comes to using them.
When we look at how we approach it, because AI is part of our world everywhere, and you mentioned also when it's formally embedded, the real benefits it can bring to multilateral deliberations. Thinking of member states that maybe don't have the same resources as bigger ones, what are the risks that we don't use AI, and how can it be used in a way that's of benefit to all in multilateral fora?
So that's a great question. And actually, it's very unique to the structure of the UN. And it's something that we do bring up also because it needs to be addressed, is the question of resources. So one of the reasons that member state might adopt generative AI is because of productivity gains. Many member states that are represented in the UN, so in New York and in Geneva, have very, very small permanent missions. There might only be one person or two people that are really following a number of different issues, and they're very, very, very strained. So what they will argue is that if they're able to use generative AI to accelerate their work, then they will be more often represented in these different deliberative forums, because otherwise they can't even attend. This is an issue because the G7 countries, for example, have really big permanent missions. So this is a little bit of a trap where the under-resourced countries are going to say, well, this is increasing our capability and our capacity. However, we need to keep in mind, again, how it's being used. If we have an AI agent that is now writing the perspective of a small member state, the member state may believe that now they're being authentically represented to a greater extent and there's more inclusion on the global stage, but that is not necessarily the case, because whose perspective is that agent really representing? That needs to be acknowledged, first of all, because it will be a huge incentive for adoption, in particularly the informal uses. So once we acknowledge this idea and acknowledge that if it's not used properly, it could actually have the inverse effect of what smaller member states are hoping to achieve, then we can start thinking about solutions and hopefully being able to still increase productivity and use a very powerful tool, but without really undermining state representation and sovereignty and agency.
So let's talk about solutions then. How can we ensure that AI can be leveraged ethically, fairly, sustainably in global deliberations? What do we need to do to make that happen?
I think that addressing the specific use of generative AI tools right now is really important. There's a couple of broader issues that really need to be addressed. For example, the whole question of privacy and the type of data that the AI tools are being built upon. So increasingly, we're finding solutions where AI tools are able to be enclosed, where what happens in the relationship or the kind of interaction with the AI tool is not going back to the kind of main training model. And that's really important in terms of confidentiality. That's something that needs to be brought up as well. And that's why uses of AI need to be disclosed so that you can make sure that they're secure. There's a possibility increasingly of having AI tools that are trained on your country's own documentation and policy frameworks. And that's extremely important. You can only do that if you're intentional. And so what we propose in our research is this idea of ethics by design, and to really thinking through how are we going to avoid these traps. And for me, it's a question of intentionality. So this idea of designing the tool that is going to be used by diplomats and policymakers in such a way that it's very uniquely connected to the data and information and policy positions that you want to represent. So that's more of a technical perspective, but it can only be done if people disclose. So the question of disclosure, I think, is also important. We're in a transition period in our use of AI where people are a little bit worried about being called out. We have a very kind of mixed approach to AI because on the one hand, we're saying, let's have wide-reaching AI adoption and let's have inclusion and bridge the digital divide through AI. And on the other hand, when people are using AI in their day-to-day work, they can be shamed. So the idea of disclosure is something that I saw at the Brookings Institution. They published a really interesting disclosure policy where there's open dialogue inside a policy team and a research team on use of AI. And researchers explain and talk about where they're actually using AI so that it can be brought to light. So we don't necessarily need to disclose our use of AI in a deliberative process. You don't need to stand in front of the General Assembly and say, I use AI to write my speech. But certainly thinking through how am I going to talk about this with a supervisor, peers, and make sure that it's being used responsibly is super important. And it'll help take away the shame, which also helps use it from a very critical perspective and not kind of like as a blanket thinking for me tool. So that's really important. And I think what I really want to do with this is also start having dialogue around AI tools and deliberations. I think we need to talk more about this and be more open and honest. I do feel that this idea, for example, of AI tools now being kind of invited to a lot of dialogues at the UN, especially the online ones, some of which are formal dialogues, member state mandated formal discussions, and you have an AI tool there. People have not been choosing this. There hasn't been any conversation about what is this AI tool doing? Where is this information and data doing? Has there been any consideration of the data leakages that are happening? So that's where I think we need to have a lot more conversation and be very, very intentional and specific in the way in which we're going to use AI.
I'm sure there's a lot that's going to happen in this space as you work on this. Thank you so much for sharing all of this knowledge with us today. We wish you the best as you continue this research and look at the ethics of AI use in deliberations. Is there an open source resource you'd like to share with our listeners if they'd like to learn a bit more?
Yes, I'm happy to share the blog post on Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs where some of these ideas began to be developed. And our paper will be published shortly. And so I'll make sure to share it so that you can add it to the podcast page. I think there'll be many more of these publications coming up soon.
Really interesting. Eleonore Fournier-Tombs, thank you so much for joining us. See you soon. Take care.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here.